We're continuing our study in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 20 through 22. Well, actually 17 through 34, but I'm going to read 20 through 22 is our theme verse. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise. Let's pray. Father, we come to you, Lord, understanding that this text was an indictment on the Corinthian church. And I pray, Father, that it would not be an indictment on us ever. Lord, that we would heed the warnings that we're going to see in this text today, Lord, for when we gather together to celebrate at your table. And I pray, Father, that you would help me to speak this morning, Lord, as I continue to struggle with the after effects of that flu, Lord. And I just pray that you would help me to just deliver your word, Father, in accordance with what Paul wrote and what you intended, Father. We thank you and praise you for all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Excuse me, I feel like I have a coughing fit. Pardon me if I do. Man, every once in a while it gets bad and it just starts running in my lungs. So, all right, let's see if I can get through this. Well, of course, first of all, I want to say thank you to John L. for last week. She was on the spot. This week she had a little bit more notice. One more day, yeah. And so Larry being out with the COVID, she stepped up, and just want to thank you for that and praise you. You know, yeah. Awesome job. Thank you. And, of course, I know some of you like it because she's all hymns. And, you know, a little story before I get started is when I first got saved, I was Catholic. And I stayed in the Catholic Church for a year because, you know, just being honest, I hated hymns. And when I went to the Baptist church, they had an organ and a piano and sung nothing but hymns. And I said, I can't handle that. And so I went to the Catholic church, and they had guitars and folk music, and I said, okay, that's how powerful music can be. And, of course, after a year, I finally realized I didn't need to be there. Went to that Baptist church, got baptized, and guess what? I love hymns. You know, it's not just Jesus in my heart, it's Jesus changed me. And so I love hymns now, and so God's done a work in me, and he can do a work in you if you just give him a chance. Yes. It's not mints. It's in my lungs. It's not going to help me. Thank you, though. All right. Well, last week we entered into a new section of Paul's epistle to the Corinthians that the section begins in 11, verse 2, and runs through chapter 14. Now, the overall theme is proper order in worship throughout this whole section. Now, last week we took a very conclusive and illuminating and enlightening look at head coverings, right? And taught you everything you needed to know about that passage with total clarity. Okay, I'm being facetious. We looked at order in worship regarding men and women in praying and prophesying, of course, dealing with the head covering issue. And Paul affirmed the tradition, which the Corinthians had generally upheld, apparently, that men should pray with heads uncovered and women should pray or prophesy with their heads covered. Now, I believe that the real goal for Paul was to maintain, especially in the light of the current cultural expectations of the day, a firm distinction between men and women. That was, to me, the real issue, is to maintain that because that's rooted in the very creation order. And to blur that in worship is to deny God's creative intentions and to bring disorder into worship. And that's, if I didn't make that clear enough, that's what the text is about, is order. And that's what this text is about, order. And that's what the next section about spiritual gifts is going to be about, order within the church. And so, and there's so much in that text that, as y'all saw, that is so inconclusive. It's just a hard text. But I wanted to bring that to you. The two things that you should get out of that for sure, distinctions in the genders and order in the church. And so if you can maintain that, then I think you got the spirit of it. Whether or not we participate in the strict tradition or not. All right, so now Paul praised them, of course, for keeping this tradition, even though some in the church seem to be objecting to doing so. Now in today's passage, Paul takes a decidedly negative point of view regarding the manner in which the Corinthians were trying to keep the tradition of the Lord's Supper. In fact, Paul's rather matter-of-fact approach to head coverings disappears, and a passionate correction ensues. So he's with head coverings, he was not using strong rhetoric. He was just kind of laying it out there. Here he gets a little uptight, and the language is appropriate. Now, what was the problem that got Paul so riled up? Divisions at the Lord's Supper, which were predicated along sociological lines. Now, Fee notes this. He says, this issue is the one certain instance in part 2 of the letter. He's talking about chapters 7 through 16. So this is the one certain instance in part 2 of the letter that is not in response to their letter. Remember, they wrote the letter, and he's not responding to their letter right now. This means that, that as in part 1, chapters 1 through 6, we receive more information from Paul himself as to the nature of the abuse because he tells the Corinthians what he knows about it. And 2, that the level of rhetoric is also more like part 1, where he took strong exception to what he had heard. So now we're getting more information because remember on head coverings and some of these other things that we've talked about, Paul is responding to them, and we don't even really know what was going on there. We have to figure it out. It's like listening to one side of the conversation of a phone. You kind of have to, it's kind of what it's about, but you're not sure. And if you don't know who's on that phone, you're like, really, kind of. Well, you have to figure that out with much of Corinthians is what's going on over there, what are they saying over there. But here Paul is more clear because he's giving them the report of what he's heard. And we'll see that. Now, another thing that to take into consideration here is the structure. It helps us kind of get at what Paul's getting at in this whole thing. Remember in chapters 5 through 6, Paul dealt with sexual immorality in the church. And then in chapter 7, he offers marriage and instruction on marriage, which is presumably he means that to be the solution for sexual immorality. Then in chapters 8 through 10, he deals with eating food offered to idols and the idea or the issue of idolatry altogether. And following that, chapters 11 through 14 offer orderly worship, proper worship. So improper worship and idolatry is followed up by proper worship. And that starts in chapter 11. But in chapter 11 itself, there's 2 major topics. And the first one is head coverings, which, remember, as I said, may have had something to do with being provocative, with women being provocative within the context of the church. So that may be addressing sexual immorality. And with the Lord's Supper, what are we talking about? Eating and drinking. And what did Paul talk about in chapters 8 through 10? Eating and drinking, and this is a big matter. So you see, he's continuing these themes. So keep those kinds of things in mind as we continue our study, starting in verse 17 of chapter 11. Let's read. Now, in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. This starts off with Paul's first rebuke. In verse 17, now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better, but for the worse. Now, this contrasts strongly with Paul's previous commendation of praise regarding head coverings. This is typical of Paul. You ever notice this? he begins often with a praise and a commendation, and you're wonderful, but I have this against you. He brings a hammer down after that. Well, that's kind of what he's done in this chapter. He started off saying, I praise you for keeping that tradition. Now let's talk about one that you're really blowing it in, And so I think he's trying to build a connection and affirm them at the same time, be able to speak some truth into their life. So just as Paul's statement of praise in the beginning of chapter 11 looked forward to the discussion of head coverings, so here the instructions given without praise look forward to the verses that follow. And so listen to how he says it again. He says, here it is. Now in giving these instructions, I do not praise you. Again, giving these instructions, I do not praise you, since you don't come together for the good. Now, think about that. Fee says, what one expects next is some expression of the content of the instructions. What one gets, however, is the reason why he cannot praise them. So he didn't give them any instructions. He doesn't really give them instructions until the very end. He gives them critique and then some reminders and some warnings. And so we're going to see that. But the first thing that he does is give them this praise, and then he gives them a report. Tells them the report that he got on them. And he says in verse 18, first of all, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. Note how Paul is explicitly addressing their gathering together as a church. Now, the early church seemed to have observed the Lord's Supper with or in conjunction with a meal. So either the Lord's Supper is celebrated as a meal or a meal took place at the same time. That I could really get into the context of all that, and it'd be important. When they did the Passover, it wasn't just a ritual; it was a meal, and we might do something with that in the near future, just to kind of bring all that together. But the understanding is that they gathered together to eat. You see this in passages like Acts 20, verse 7. Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. And he goes on, and the guy, I think that's the text where the guy falls out and dies and comes back and all that stuff. But they met on the first day of the week, and they gathered together to break bread. That's probably them taking the Lord's Supper together. Now, the report that Paul had received, as we're going to see, concerned how they conducted themselves in observing this meal. It was divisive. And this is not surprising, and Paul is fully ready to believe it. Why is it not surprising that they're divisive at the Lord's Supper? Not a rhetorical question. Why is Paul not surprised that they had divisions? Who's he writing to? The Corinthians. What's the first thing he addresses? Divisions. Remember, the first part of the whole book is about divisions. But this is a different kind of division. But he's not surprised by it. He's willing to believe it. Yep, y'all got divisions, and in part, I believe it. Maybe not of everybody, but of some. And so, he wants them to not have divisions, but he's going to address here what his real concern is, and that is with class-driven division. Where there should be no slave nor free, no kind of distinctions like that. This is going to be class-driven division. Now, remember, in the early part, it was about leaders and stuff. They were divided over. It was more like denominationalism. Here, it's more class, rich versus poor. Notice in 1 Corinthians, and we'll move on to the next section here. It says in verse 19, verse through 21, it says, "For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you." So, I believe it, for there must be also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. That is key right there. For in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. Now, what Paul means by this first sentence isn't altogether clear. Imagine that. Paul in Corinthians not being clear. Surprise, surprise. Well, Thistleton proposes that we should take the part of that statement as a restatement of the Corinthian position. And he translates it this way. For dissensions are unavoidable, it is claimed among you, in order that those who are tried and true among you may be visibly revealed. So in our text, for there must also be factions among you, he takes that as them saying, divisions are going to happen, and the reason why you guys are saying that is because you want to have a way to exalt yourself. That's Thistleton. Rosner and Kemp and Rosner, they say this. Of course, or they say that it's sarcastic, that it's, that Paul is being sarcastic in his statement. And I would say it like this. Of course there are factions among you. How else will you show yourselves to be privileged people blessed by God? So when Paul says, for there also must be factions among you, he's just being sarcastic. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't surprise me. Because one of the things about Paul is he's what? Sarcastic. He's very sarcastic. God is too, if you read some of the Psalms. God uses a little sarcasm here and there. And that warms my soul because a good dear friend of mine just the other day told me I'm the most sarcastic person he's ever heard. John Hughes. So at least sarcasm isn't sin in and of itself. But Paul can be used sinfully, of course. But Paul is he's got this kind of trait. But there's a different way of looking at this. Fee argues that it is, in fact, a theological statement about the necessity of divisions in God's overall plan. He says, in keeping with the teaching of Jesus, Paul expected divisions to accompany the end, divisions that would separate true believers from those who were false. Thus, by this evil thing, their divisions, God is working out the divine purposes. Those who truly belong to God, the tested, approved, those who have passed the examination, are already being manifest in their midst, and presumably they will escape the final judgment that is coming upon the world. So he takes it as a positive statement from Paul that there's going to be divisions because God is going to use that to identify those who are approved. In other words, denominations are going to occur because some denominations are so far out there that we know that they have lost touch with the gospel. And that we need to separate from that denomination. And so that's kind of what some people think Paul is saying here. The Greek wording actually favors Fee's interpretation, that it's a theological statement. But it just seems more consistent to Paul's character to take this as sarcasm. He's man, I mean, you reign. I wish I reigned with you. He's a sarcastic guy. In the end, whether Paul affirms the unwelcome but necessary reality of divisions, or he is sarcastically mocking those who are causing the divisions, the problem is real. Divisions occur. Even if that's part of God's allowed plan, they're still wrong. That's divisions in the body of Christ should not exist at all. Unfortunately for us, in our real world situation, they do. They exist. They not only exist denominationally and throughout the world, they often exist within churches. And here they existed, and they seem to have existed along class lines. Because look at what he says. Therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Paul flatly contradicts that they're even participating in the Lord's Supper. What they are doing cannot be described as such. Why? For in eating, one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. So, what if Paul happened to show up here and said to us, what y'all are doing is not even the Lord's Supper. You've missed it. That's what he's telling them. you've completely missed it. Now, often we find the reference to drunkenness shocking. They were drunk at the Lord's Supper? But that's not really Paul's main concern. He throws that out there, but he doesn't address it. For those coming out of the pagan culture, it would have been a common thing to get drunk in a religious context. When you went to a feast for Dionysius or Bacchus, same guy, you would drink and do worse things, And so they're coming out of that culture, and so Paul's having to correct a lot of that. This is what the Gentiles struggled with. But he mentioned drunkenness a few times, but what he really hammered on was idolatry and sexual immorality. But that's not even the problem here. His real concern is, and this is demonstrated by how he addresses it, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry. To understand what is going on, probably going on, we need to understand the cultural context. Houses in Roman Corinth, especially, and I meant to get you a picture and I forgot, especially among the wealthy who could host a larger crowd, and that's usually where they would meet, is in homes, at one of the larger homes. So the wealthy would host a church. Those houses had two areas in which people could have dined. The first was called the triclinium. It corresponds to our modern dining room, except that it had 3 tables around the edges at which you reclined to eat. I don't know about you, but the idea of laying down and eating just doesn't, not laying down, I guess laying sideways, man, that just seems like a recipe for indigestion. But, so they didn't have dining chairs around the table. They reclined. Only about 9 to 12 people, usually only 9, would fit in the triclinium. 9 people. What do you do with the other people? Well, they had a second room where the guests would be able to eat. That was a larger space called the atrium. Now, some of these atriums could hold up to 50 guests, the larger ones. So some of them are small. So in this home, it'd be us guys. This is about as big a church as you're going to get. Maybe not even quite this big. And so they're coming together. Now, Fee explains the problem that this situation suggests. In a class-conscious society such as Roman Corinth would have been, it would be sociologically natural for the host to invite those of one's own class to eat in the triclinium, the modern dining room, while the others would eat in the atrium. Furthermore, it is probable that the language, your own private suppers, or you eat alone idea, refers to the eating of private meals by the wealthy, in which at the common meal of the Lord's Supper they ate either their own portions or perhaps privileged portions that were not made available to the have-nots. So they didn't all eat together in the atrium. Some of them ate in the triclinium where the good stuff was. Now, this is not just Paul's complaint about them. He's complaining about them in the context of the Lord's Supper, but listen to this. This kind of behavior went on even among the pagans. Juvenal devotes an entire satire to excoriating the wealthy for this very thing. And in Epigram 360 it says, "Since I am asked to dinner, why is not the same dinner served to me as to you? You take oysters fattened in the lacrine lake, I suck a mussel through a hole in the shell. You get mushrooms, I take hog funguses. You tackle turbot, but I brill. Golden with fat, a turtle dove gorges you with its bloated rump. There is set before me a magpie that has died in its cage. Why do I dine without you, although I am dining with you?" In other words, this would actually go on at the same table. If you had 9 guests in the triclinium, 3 would get the good stuff, and maybe 6 would not, or have it right there in the same thing. So even more so out in the atrium. In fact, what seems to be happening is some are going hungry. They don't even provide enough food for the whole bunch. So, there's people coming that are being set aside by class. And the privileged, the approved among them, are making themselves known by their place at the feast. Remember what Jesus talked about? You know, those who want the best seats. Well, it's so bad in Rome and Greece that the best seats, they aren't just the best seats, that's the best food. Or they might even have food where other seats might not. And so Paul continues in verse 22. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. They are shaming the poor at a supper that is observed to commemorate the sacrificial death of Christ for everyone. And worse, as we'll see, it is an attack on the unity of the body. Chiampi and Rosner say, rather than serving to build up the church in love, which would be for the better, their meetings serve to tear down and humiliate some members in the presence of others. Well, let's continue. The significance of this is the tradition. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 23 through 26. For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the same night in which he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into the Lord's Supper itself because we're going to cover that another day, and we've done it in the past. But I want to focus on what Paul's point is here. Paul either means, when he says that he received from the Lord Jesus, that he received it as special revelation direct from Jesus, or he means that he received it by tradition that originated with Jesus. Either way, Paul reminds them that he has given them this tradition. He has passed it on to them. And it ought to be clear that how they are behaving is completely at odds with what Christ did for them. So by reminding them of the tradition, Paul points to the significance of the body and blood of Christ. And he's going to especially make the point about that in relation to unity. Remember what he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 16 through 17? He said, the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. You see what he's getting at there? The body, the communion of the body of Christ points to the church, the assembly, the body of Christ. Because we all partake of that one bread, we are, although many, we are one. One bread and one body. So participation in the Lord's Supper confirms and establishes unity in Christ. So he brings the tradition back to them. Look what Christ did. What's this all about? Think deeply about the Lord's Supper as it's supposed to, what it's supposed to be, and now he's fixing to say, consider yourself in light of that. And so he brings them the tradition, reminds them of it, and then he points to the danger. 1 Corinthians 11, 27 through 32. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. This is a very serious turn that Paul is taking here. Think about what he's saying here, the unworthy manner. The emphasis here is on the manner in which one eats and drinks the Lord's Supper. It's not on the person who eats or drinks. Now, too often this text has been understood to mean that we must purify our hearts and confess our sins and come to the table washed of our sins. And if we don't, we'll be judged. But that altogether misses what Paul intends. In fact, When we come to the table, we come in faith that our sins have already been washed by the blood. We come to find grace to overcome our sins. Now, confession is, of course, and this is, something I hammer on in discipleship and confession and people dealing with addictions and all that stuff. Confession is a mainstay of Christian spirituality, and it's necessary. You must confess your sins, or you won't ever get over them. I remember when Ray Boltz come out that he was homosexual, and he decided that he had tired of wrestling with homosexuality. He was done with wrestling with it, and he just decided that since he couldn't overcome the sin, he was just going to, acknowledge it and be it. Now, he's a Christian songwriter. Now, here's the thing. He finally confessed it to his family and said, I'm gay. Well, other than the people he had committed the sin with, who knew? He'd never confessed it. He had never confessed his sins. You cannot overcome sin apart from confession. I don't mean going, y'all come over here and sit in the booth with me and confess to me. They do have that right in the sense of confession. They just do it a little wrong. But the idea is that we confess it to God, acknowledge it to God, and when necessary, which is often, to someone else too. You don't have to do every single sin. A friend of mine was going to try to overcome sin. He wanted to call me every time he committed a sin. I said, dude, I didn't want to be on the phone that long. He'd be calling me every 5 minutes. Confession is necessary. It's part of the Christian life. 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. I take that as an ongoing practice in that text. I know some don't, but I do. So confession is essential. However, that's not what this text is about. This isn't about a time of prayer before the Lord's Supper in which you examine your heart to make sure that you haven't sinned, or if you have a sin, that you confess it. That's not what this is about. That's not what Paul's hammering at. See, the problem is that by the manner in which they are partaking of the Lord's Supper, it was, one, no longer the Lord's Supper, and two, it was denying the very unity that Christ purchased with his body and blood. Thus, they are guilty of, or liable for, maybe even sinned against, the body and blood of Jesus. Not to mention that their behavior was inherently unloving. So Paul says, but let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner, get what he's supposed to be examining himself for? For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. That is not an argument for transubstantiation, because in the broader context, what are we talking about here? The body, the unity of the body, order and worship. And so, not discerning the Lord's body, you're not paying attention to the church. You're not realizing that what you're doing is in the body of Christ, and you're dividing it with this class warfare that you've got going on. Now, so Paul's not telling them to examine themselves for any and all sin, but examine the manner in which you are partaking in the Lord's Supper. The problem is that they were not discerning the body, and so causing all these problems. And so they're really, dividing the body with these private meals, their apparent social stratification that left some hungry, and their overindulgence. And he says, for this reason many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. This is terminal, This is serious business. It's killing some of them. And some of them are sick because of it. Now, he didn't say all who get sick are getting sick because of sin. He didn't say that. He didn't say anyone that dies is, being struck with judgment from God. He didn't say that. What he said is that because of this, many are weak and sick among you, and many die. So apparently, along with the report about their behavior, Paul also received a report concerning their medical condition, and it wasn't good. They're already under the chastening hand of God. Again, not because they failed to confess all of their sins before eating the Lord's Supper, but because they were eating in a manner that made a mockery of it. Now, two things to note about this chastening. First, it's avoidable. And second, it has a good purpose. Paul says, for if we, and notice the we there, he switched to a first person plural to kind of include himself. I'm a sinner too, and I got to deal with this too. For if we would judge ourselves, that word means examine ourselves, we would not be judged. But when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord that we may not be condemned with the world. CSB translates it, if we were properly evaluating ourselves, we would not be judged. Because they weren't examining their actions in the light of Christ and what this tradition really meant, they were being judged by God. But the purpose was that they may be delivered from the judgment of the wicked. Now, I want you to think about this. When somebody passes away, we always say, they've gone to a better place. I think of my buddy Teddy. Man, right now, he's up there enjoying the Lord. Understands all the mysteries now. And thinking to himself, Kurt, you're so wrong. You just don't even get it yet, buddy. Oh, the surprises we're going to have on that day, when God corrects all of our thinking. We're going to be shocked at just how wrong we probably have it. But anyways, and I rejoice that Teddy's there. But you know what? It's not just a negative thing for me that Teddy's gone and his family. It's a negative thing for Teddy. Remember, when in the Scripture, it portrays long life as a blessing, not a curse. And sometimes we think in terms of how much better off people are when they die, and of course that's true, but a life cut short is a life that misses out on opportunities to serve the Lord and reap treasure in heaven. That's why it's wrong to kill. I mean, in my insane logic sometimes, especially when the devil starts whispering, I always thought, man, all that's going on, why didn't Adam and Eve just kill their kids and be done with it? Just end it right there. You wouldn't have all this mess. But then we wouldn't have the bride of Christ. And we wouldn't have the treasure in heaven and all that comes out of that. God intended this world to produce something good that can only come through this world. And sometimes when a life is cut short, it's a judgment from God. Sometimes, not always. And sometimes it's judgment from God. And guess what? It robs you of the opportunity, when it's your own fault, of building treasure in heaven. Remember, this is where we gather the treasure. That's where we enjoy it. Right now, we need to be gathering up the treasure, serving Christ, walking with Him, living it out. Gathering up the treasure here on earth doesn't do us any good. You can't take it. But you can certainly deposit it into heaven, and then when you get there, you're going to enjoy it. Well, the solution. What is the solution to all this? Paul is pretty simple in his solution. Chapter 11, verse 33 through 34. Therefore, my brothers, when you come together to eat, come together for the Lord's Supper, wait for one another. If anyone is hungry, he should eat at home. Take care of that business first, so that when you gather together, you will not come under judgment. And I will give instructions about the other matters whenever I come. So he's going to wait to give them the rest of the instructions. The solution is simple and direct. On the one hand, when they come together to eat, they should wait for each other. It could be receive or accept or welcome, but the idea is probably wait for each other. And on the other hand, those who intend to eat sumptuously should do that at home apart from this meal. If you're given over to gluttony, stay at home or be last in line. Do something like that. Now, just applying this simple little corrective will keep them from the judgment, the chastening hand of God. Eat at home and wait for each other. Don't be having these divisions, these class divisions. Pretty much solves the problem. Well, how do we apply that? We're going to apply that by taking the Lord's Supper. We're going to apply it by taking the Lord's Supper with honor and respect to God. Understanding that it's by his death that we are brought into the body of Christ with one another, united with one another. We're united with him, and we're united with one another. So who are my two guys coming up? Okay. Y'all want to come up?